To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of this work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Transmisogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and today I'm joined by our guest, William C. Anderson. William is a writer and activist from Birmingham, Alabama. He is the author of The Nation on No Map from AK Press in 2021, and co-author of the book As Black as Resistance, also from AK Press in 2018. He's also the co-founder of Offshoot Journal and provides creative direction as a producer of the Black Autonomy podcast. And I've asked him on today to talk about a column that he's been writing for Prism for almost a year now called Another Way Out. And we're going to be focusing on the one that he wrote in early June called Fighting Back Against Inaction. William, welcome to the Death Panel.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so glad to have you on the show finally. Your work has been deeply influential to me over the years, and it just moves with clarity and urgency through and against the mess of liberal platitudes and, shell games that dominate mainstream political discourse in the US. And I think your work has always insisted that we really take struggle seriously, not as a metaphor or a mood, but as a real material process. And we wanted to talk with you now because this moment demands the kind of clarity that your work offers. And we're watching, fascism consolidate in real time within the state. Millions are told that their one political duty is to vote and that anything else is a distraction or, worse yet, a trap. And that can be incredibly frustrating and demoralizing, not to mention demobilizing. And in your latest piece, Fighting Back Against Inaction, you really refuse that framework. You call out the intellectualization of passivity, the moralizing of detachment, and the kind of self-congratulatory tendencies of liberalism that often mistake memory for movement or action. And you write, quote, "Revolutionary change is not ordered like a meal or some product online. It's also not voted in by exporting decisions to a representative. It's fought long and hard and won through persistent struggle. It's the same struggle that we're supposed to carry forward when we understand the lengths that others went to before us," end quote. And I think, the piece will be particularly inspiring and heartening for our listeners to think about right now because in it, you challenge not just the institutions of electoral politics, but really the kind of culture of liberal disengagement, posturing, and misremembering that's so dominant right now, especially in certain areas. But before we dig into this latest piece, you and I were talking and planning for this episode about wanting to start by taking a step back and actually looking at the political project of your column, again, called Another Way Out as a whole, which has been going for about a year now. So back in November, we mentioned your column, Fascism Cannot Be Overrun at the Ballot Box, in an episode that we did about the sort of misremembering that's actually central to that immediate post-electoral posturing and commentary that was going on. And I also think that we recently touched on your December column, The Propaganda of Violence, maybe in one or both of the episodes that we did with friend of the panel, Vicky Osterweil. You'll have to forgive me for not remembering the exact episodes. I'm not quite at tip-top shape at the moment. The baby is doing great, and we are having so much fun getting to know them, but with less sleep than usual. My usually quite sharp recall for what we talked about and which episode is less than up to my usual standards right now. But that's all to say that it's a really good column and it's full of important inspiration and analysis on why it's so important to focus our limited energies and capacities on material struggle, infrastructure, and collective power. So with all that, William, to open us up, what is the political project behind Another Way Out as a whole? What are you trying to build or shift politically, emotionally, and ideological with this series? And how do you see it intervening in the present?
First and foremost, I have to say thank you because you gave me such a flattering introduction. I really appreciate it. And I feel very seen when people share things about feeling the emotions and the calls to action that I'm trying to communicate with my words. So I just deeply appreciate you saying all those things. It means a lot to me. And I would say that to kind of give some context behind this column, it's really important to think about it as a part of a broader project that I'm working on. And so the concept behind this column is really me writing commentary that is inspired by underappreciated rank and file radicals who inspire us to build from below. And so when I say from below, what I mean is I'm thinking about a project here that tries to bring more recognition to those who are often overlooked because they don't necessarily stand out in this sort of great man version of history.
Mm-hmm.
The left is very much participating in too in its renderings of history and its stories and its traditions and its veneration. So I'm thinking about people who are theorists and radicals and revolutionaries and artists like Martin Sostre, like UC Quayana, like Joseph Edwards, who is known as the Caribbean situationist, Camille Yarborough and Lucy Parsons, and just a number of people who might not be as familiar to others. And again, emphasizing coming from below and building from below is at the core of that. And so the U.S. left is, particularly sectarian. I think is very dogmatic. I think is very oversimplified in its relationship to history. And I think that that's why we have to tell stories that complicate the narrative so that political education doesn't become any more religious than it already is in the West, particularly. So each piece refers back to other pieces that preceded it. And ultimately, I'm trying to lay a foundation. I'm trying to map out some things for a broader counter historical project through commentary and public facing political education.
Thank you so much for setting it up like that, William, because I think, one thing that this latest piece also feels like it's responding to directly is not something that's just been in the air right now, right? This is a kind of enduring and long problem that we're engaging with today, which ultimately, like as you're saying, the entire column itself is really geared towards that. And in particular, this one focuses on a kind of position of weaponized resignation. People are turning to inaction as a kind of posture of resistance. And you write it with urgency, but also with a kind of like empathetic frustration. You open the essay by writing, quote, "A peculiar self-inflicted subterfuge is overrunning many people in the U.S. Inaction is being misrepresented as a principled stance against this society's failure to deliver progress to its people. And while it's true that the brunt of expectations about who needs to do what to make change are disproportionately distributed, there's something sinister among us. A cold environment of hubris, resentment, and blaming victims has generated conditions ripe for exploitation." I especially, would like to spend time talking about, the way that the mainstream liberal discourse treats the South as disposable is a big part of the essay. And I thought we could maybe start with talking through the argument of the piece and sort of contextualizing it by talking about what you were responding to specifically, sort of what you're trying to center in this one, why you wanted to write this piece. And that could be a kind of a way to introduce the essay to listeners who haven't yet had a chance to read it and, gesture us towards a kind of example of what you're talking about here about bringing a kind of bringing like a different mode of attention to thinking about history also in the context of the political left in the US. Getting into like what kind of narratives or tendencies feel especially dangerous or sinister right now, and also moving into a kind of space of what is to be done from there.
So the thing that made me feel like I needed to address this, because again, with this column, I'm trying to respond to what I'm seeing, if not get ahead of things that I expect to come later. Mm-hmm. But what I was trying to respond to with this particular piece that we're talking about was that really concerning sentiment that I was seeing increasing in the community and online and in different spaces. I was just starting to hear more and more people saying like, we've done enough. We're not going to fight anymore. This is like not worth our energy. Like we need to retire and give up and or become more inactive or find these more passive ways of resistance and so on and so forth. And I was actually hearing this coming from a number of Black people. And the reason that I found it concerning was because it was drawing on this particularly frustrating understanding, I think, that many people have of history, especially Black history. And it treats Black history as if it is a complete project, as if struggle rather, within the civil rights movement, within the Black Power movement, and many of the movements that precede us are a complete project. And I find this so troubling because you don't like reach this point where you have made it to the end of the road and you're suddenly done with organizing or fighting or resisting or struggling. This is an ongoing thing that happens over time. You don't just resign yourself because you feel like things have gotten so hard that you shouldn't have to participate any longer. But I think that the way that we understand and have a relationship to history and to the stories that we tell ourselves about history and how we think about it is what could lead someone to have that misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I think just to kind of give a little bit more context here, I think that Black history has been absorbed by the state. And I think that it has been neutralized by a lot of popular Black historical projects. One of the first ones that would come to mind would be the 1619 Project. It said things like, I think the phrasing was like America wasn't a democracy until Black people made it one. And, when I hear something like that, I'm like, well, it's not a democracy now, but something like that dupes people into thinking we've arrived at a place that we haven't. And, there's other things like I quote from this piece that I had written prior called Black History and the Voting Myth, which is a response to the idea that Black people's our ancestors solely died for the right to vote and participate in representative democracy. And so, I think about things like that. I think about, I also reference Hortense Spillers in this piece, talking about Black history commemorations, misleading people into thinking the struggle is complete. And I also have to bring in the fact that I'm from the South, which is a place that commodifies and sells Black history for tourist dollars and turns it into this very fairy tale like narrative where it's, oh, okay, we used to have a lot of problems amongst each other, but we figured it all out. We integrated and now that's all over. Everything is good. There's no need to fight. And so when I hear people say like, we've done enough, we don't need to be, putting ourselves at risk or going outside and struggling against the authorities or whatever the case may be. We don't need to do that anymore. It's because people have relationships to Black history and to struggle more largely that are informed by these state influenced and structured narratives about what point we're at now. And it is actually really a good way of tricking people into feeling complacent.
Mm-hmm. I feel like there's a real kind of short circuit that happens if you are in the position of approaching politics where you see sort of your sole point of engagement as participating in electoral cycles and representative democracy. Partially, it's a very indirect process. And what we're talking about here is a kind of, you're encouraging people towards direct work, towards the kinds of material work where you're not, in electoralism, it's easy to think about it as like, oh, we've been given this kind of enfranchisement and this is, therefore part of a larger process or arc of justice, right? And that voting is kind of the end all be all. But when we think about what a democratic processes in the United States, quote unquote, this is a representative democracy by name. In practice is a whole other thing, right? But like it's about participating in electoral cycles. Then someone gets elected. Then you make these indirect requests, right? Where you might see a need in your community and perhaps you go to your elected representative, you try and highlight the importance of that need, push them, make requests, make demands. And then you're kind of stuck in this position of waiting and constantly seeking to kind of discipline or exercise your opinion to move emotionally or logically move that representative towards advocating for you within the larger body that they're, just one representative in. And this takes up like a lot of energy. And in the context of like the kind of broad abandonment of the South by the state, right? Like it produces very little tangible material results in people's lives. Like those problems that people are bringing to their elected representatives after they've, oftentimes put a lot of time and energy into door knocking and fundraising and, going all out to get this person elected. They don't see a lot of return on that labor that they've put into it and the emotional labor that goes into it. And that's why I sort of said you approach this with like empathetic frustration where you understand very clearly this kind of process that people are tied up in. And particularly in the South, it's quite acute because not only are you in a part of the country where there is like some of the most extreme state abandonment, both at the state level and the federal level, but it also like as a block gets blamed by liberals in the North and on the West Coast for things that have nothing to do with the people who actually live in the South, right? There's a attitude of like, oh, well, fuck the South. They fucked around and found out, as if the problem with the South is that it's not sufficiently revving people up to participate in these electoral cycles. But again, we're all talking about this process that's like incredibly indirect. And part of what you're saying in this piece, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that sort of indirect politics, right? Which for so many people, they're taught this is the way to do it. And this is, the kind of liberal dogma of how to have political agency in the United States. That's not going to really do anything to stop the state from killing your neighbors, right? And to actually be working on the sort of material level, we have to do things that are more direct, right? And this is kind of what you're trying to push people towards, I think.
Yeah. So there's a few things there that, we can get into. One of the first things is, we're really talking about the difference between representative democracy versus direct democracy. And, direct democracy is also just a name for a lot of the politics that I would say that I think we should aspire to. But there's a major difference in saying I'm going to take my own destiny, take my community's destiny, and we're going to take it collectively into our own hands and advocate for ourselves, fight for ourselves, and exporting that power to a representative. And so when you're thinking about representative democracy, you're ultimately talking about something that is inherently disempowering because you are taking all of your hope, all of your vision, all of your ideas, and hoping that someone will communicate those things on your behalf in Washington or wherever the case may be. And you can't expect a return that is in your favor when you do that in a political system that is as corrupt and rotten to the core as the U.S. political system is. I mean, it's really kind of an absurd thing to expect it to work out for you. This system is completely controlled by wealth and white supremacist power. It is not a system that has this sort of representation that people think that they're getting built into its mechanisms. It ultimately all leads back to making sure that the ruling class maintains what it has and that people are exploited in the ways that they need to be exploited to keep things running as they are. So it's not surprising that things end up going the way that they go. And then when you talk about the South and you talk about the ways that Black people are oppressed and abandoned and messed over, I think that that also has quite a bit to do with the way that the public oftentimes homogenizes populations because of the nation state and because of this form of organization. So, you know, I get really bothered a lot of the time by how people talk about who is this or who isn't that in this country, because for one thing, the general public in the US doesn't really seem to know the difference between race and nationality and ethnicity. You can see this reflected in the way people are talking about this past election, and specifically talking about undocumented people, Latinx people, and casting blame on Southerners. There's a lot of things that end up getting extremely oversimplified. Things like, you know, for example, people making these blanket statements about Latinx people when there are Black people who are Latinx, there are Black people who are undocumented. A lot of folks in the United States make these really oversimplified statements about different populations that they don't necessarily understand. And I think that, or don't really have a relationship to. And I think that, you know, the way we think about populations, the way we think about community, the way we think about this planet, it has a lot to do with that. So the homogenization that takes place when we think about the nation state, for example, you could think about it in two ways here. You could think about it domestically when it comes to Black Southerners, being a place where a large majority of Black people are concentrated in the United States. Well, you know, folks say, oh, well, you know, that's their problem. They shouldn't have voted this way or that way. The South deserves everything it gets, despite the fact that we know that these Black people who are in the South are not representative of the voters that folks are talking about, the white Southerners who tend to lean more towards the Republican Party, but they get swept up into that homogenization. It's similar to what people would do when you think about this in another way, which is on the international scale, the way people think whole other countries are just one thing because of this type of, you know, imperialist rationale that says, you know, well, we're going to war with Iraq or Afghanistan. And the people say, well, that means this whole country is this one thing. And they render it that way in this oversimplified way to make it sort of easier for them to process in their minds. And because they've been influenced by propaganda, it really just distorts the entire worldview we have, not just here in this country, but everywhere else. It's a lot of people that get erased and lost in these type of renderings.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.